Welcome to the Starzology Astrology podcast. I am your host, Alison Price. And in this week's episode, we've got something a little different for you. I'm going to be introducing you to a professional astrologer and good friend of mine, Toby Aldren, and he's going to be explaining to us a little bit how he uses astrology slightly differently in his practice. Welcome, Toby.
Thank you, Alison. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. Thank you for being here. I wonder if you could start by sharing with us a little bit about the approach you're taking with your astrology practice.
Sure. Recently, I heard something that described that your life makes sense most when you look at it backwards. And I think I like to apply this because I found that the path I found myself on, I did not really know where I was going in the early days. But later in life, it seems to have settled into where these various interests seem to merge together. I started out as primarily a musician. That's my background. I have a music degree, taught piano for a while, taught in the school system, especially band and choir stuff. So that's where my first training came in. It was in the 1980s that I ended up with a forearm injury from piano playing. Today they would call it a repetitive strain injury, but in those days that was really quite new, looking at musicians who had injuries. And at the time, the medical diagnosis or treatment was take an aspirin.
Right.
If something's not feeling well, take an aspirin. Or I got into trying different, what do you call them, NSAIDs, NSAID, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs.
Okay.
Anyways, none of them seemed to agree with me. And I ended up dabbling in other areas of healing, I'll call it. Certainly I started with massage, that got into shiatsu, found myself interested in aromatherapy. One of the things that worked really well was hydrotherapy and the idea of contrast bathing, where I had to plunge my arms into warm water for about 3 minutes and then into ice cold water.
Wow.
So it's this back and forth. But anyhow, at a time there, a good friend of mine said, you know what, Toby, your body is your hobby now because of exploring all these different types of therapy. So that sort of triggered an interest in healing, I'll say, not specifically medicine, but just different alternative methods of healing, I'll say. It was around that time that I started studying astrology, so that was early 90s, was exposed to medical astrology, and I read some books about very old, like 16th century ways of doing medicine using astrology. And as you're familiar, we were chatting before about like what are all those things like the four humors and different. They had red collar and yellow,
black phlegm or something.
Phlegm and all this, yes. And that the signs were considered either hot or cold, and moist or dry. So you'd have a combination of something's hot and moist. Well, if you've got too much hot and moist, you probably need cold and dry to counteract that. But those ideas of how astrology was used in medicine, I found very fascinating. I came across the name Marsilio Ficino, who was a 16th century Italian whose job combined astrology, music, and medicine. And that's when I thought, that's what I want to be when I grow up.
Right, right.
Somebody who combined those three things.
Those three features, yeah.
Yes. So I think of it like a triangle, really.
Okay.
So music in one corner, astrology in the other, and medicine or healing in the third corner.
Like a grand trine, even.
Perhaps a grand trine, yes. In the 90s, I'm actually more 2000s, I'll say, became familiar with Sue Tompkins. And I know that she is a homeopath as well as an astrologer. And she has a very interesting take on medical astrology. And in fact, I believe she's working on her latest book on medical astrology, and I hope that comes out soon. But I do love Sue's work. She uses, I'm going to say, like a traditional astrology approach as far as using the natal chart, using transits, progressions to study a period when somebody undergoes some sort of ailment. So that's one person I like to learn from.
And do you have perhaps a book or reference that you could give for our listeners there?
For Sue Tompkins, yes, her book on aspects in astrology is certainly a key book, but also her book, The Contemporary Astrologer's Handbook, is something that I say if I had to start learning astrology over again, I would like that to be my first book. Mm-hmm. So I really quite respect Sue and the work that she's done. Another person that I admire in medical astrology is Jane Ritter Patrick, who is based in Edinburgh. And I heard her do a workshop on medical astrology, I'm going to say about 5 years ago. And very interesting take here on healing the body using astrology. It didn't always have to refer back to the person's natal chart. If, for example, the person had, I'm going to use like laryngitis, and any of these ailments that end in itis are inflammations. So that tells you that Mars is involved. Anything that's got heat and inflammation is a Mars thing. So laryngitis, the larynx in the throat. So we associate that perhaps then with the sign of Taurus, the throat. And if there's inflammation there, that's like having Mars in Taurus. So in Jane's style of work, she would then explore with people this idea of Mars in Taurus, and what does that mean? Is that something about, or the idea of the throat itself, where our voice is? Is there something about anger and the voice? Is this person not expressing anger, or do they feel stifled in being able to express that? Anyhow, she's got I think a very fascinating approach to using medical astrology. Another one that I recall a story that she told was about a lipoma, I think you call it, which are basically fatty lumps that appear any place in the body. Now, if we think of a lump or a growth, that typically is a Jupiter thing. Fatty is often associated with Venus. So it's a sort of Jupiter-Venus matter, and depending on where on the body this lump is where Jane would start some discussion about Jupiter in that area or that sign, and Venus also in that sign. So I tuck that aside. That's something else as a way of healing using astrology. So I really encourage people to explore her work.
And we'll put the links to these references in the show notes below as well.
Very good. Mm-hmm. Very good. So yes, Jane's book, A Handbook of Medical Astrology, is really quite wonderful. I'm going to go into the music corner of the triangle again. And going back to my times as a school teacher in teaching band, for example, or instrumental music, I often found one of the most crucial steps in making a child successful in playing an instrument is getting the right instrument for them. I think that everybody is a musician in some way. And I think one of the key pieces here is that everybody needs to find the instrument that best suits them. So I'll share a story about one of my early days in teaching music in the school. There was a boy I'm going to say he was about 14 years old, who started on the clarinet just because I think the family had a clarinet, so they figured you should just play this. And he approached me in about October, November that year that he wanted to switch to the trumpet. And I thought, well, especially as a new teacher, that's a drastic switch. If you said clarinet to saxophone, that's okay. The fingering is pretty much the same. You'll do fine. But clarinet to trumpet, that's really a very radical change. And I was resisting having him do that. But he, convinced me he would, do his best and all this on it. And it turned out to be wonderful for him. He really excelled at playing the trumpet because that seemed to be a more natural fit to who he was. And I think that is also one part of the thing that makes me believe that not only does everybody have an instrument that suits them, but I bet there's something in their astrological chart that defines a signature for playing a certain instrument. So this is actually an area of research I would love to get into here. And I am just now starting to collect charts from musicians who identify themselves as someone who plays one particular instrument, not somebody who's dabbled in everything, because I think that would be kind of confusing. But I'm sure there's something about characteristics of a personality that equate to a certain instrument.
Okay.
So that's one of my areas of interest.
That's very interesting.
This is another kind of sideline, and also just for fun. But we have dogs here, as
yes,
lovely,
you know, lovely dogs.
Our border collies we've had. Dogs have personalities too, and I think it's kind of fun to pick an instrument for each of our dogs here.
Right.
So I encourage people to think about that. What instrument would your dog play, or a cat if you had a cat?
Right.
But there is something about personality, I think, and instruments. So our first border collie, black and white one, seemed to be, actually, she had sun in the sign of Taurus. Her birthday, I think, was May 16. And she just seemed to be a very grounding presence. And for her, I picked the cello, because in playing the cello, you are definitely anchored to the ground. It's somewhat of I think of it as somewhat of an intellectual kind of instrument, but certainly that sense of being grounded. When you play the cello, you feel the vibration of the instrument itself and sort of resonating in your own body, in that part of your body that's more kind of in your core or lower to the ground. Our next border collie, I think her traits were that she, first of all, extremely athletic, agile, I think sort of the ability to multitask, doing a whole bunch of things all over the place, but being quite independent. And I think of being a percussionist for her.
Okay.
So playing, different types of drums, marimba, xylophone, any kind of this or that, and sometimes at the same time. But so multitasking, being all over the place, I think she'd be a good percussionist. And our youngest one here is absolutely a singer. She is so vocal. She does need to express herself. When we come home, she has many stories to tell us. So I think she's a singer. So if ever I wrote a piece of music, in tribute to our dogs, it would be, voice, cello, and percussion. So an unusual combination.
Wow.
Anyways, I just thought that's fun.
So really what you're saying is that if anyone has a pet or something, you could perhaps associate a musical instrument with that pet.
Yes.
Through their nature.
I believe so.
Right.
And then I also think if you know the chart of your pet, then I bet there's a doorway there to understanding, perhaps, make believe what kind of instrument they would play. So this idea of healing, then, using music is something I'm interested in. And I think I start by looking at just the elements and going back to the idea of if you have an ailment that you associate with either too much of an element or too little of an element, then what element do you need to bring into your life? Now, for example, if a person needs more fire in their life, we would say, well, just, light a fire, light candles, turn up
Yes.
the thermostat, somehow bring heat into your life. If a person had some sort of ailment that we figured needed more air, we would encourage them to, yes, open the window, go for a walk by the ocean, get the ocean breeze through. If a person needed more water, we would have ideas about what they can do to add water to their life. Maybe just physically drinking a lot more water. Maybe having baths more frequently, or being around water, put water in you. And grounding. I think food in general is one of the things we associate with the earth element, the idea of grounding oneself through food, nutrition, plants, the earth itself. So that got me thinking about different styles of music and how they might represent different elements, certainly. So I'm going to explain that and give you a little samples of what I think might be sort of fire music or earth music, if that's okay.
Fantastic. That would be great.
All right. So I'm going to play a couple excerpts of things. Now, my instrument is piano. So this is, I don't want to say biased, but my repertoire is piano music. But that can be certainly opened up to any type of music, any type of genre, as long as you sort of aim for what I think might be these kind of qualities. Now, fire music, sometimes actually in the music itself, the composer will make a marking of kan fuoko, which means with fire. So to have this sort of fiery, passionate kind of music is what we're after. I think sometimes a rhythmical emphasis is something we can attribute to fire. Something that makes you want to get up and move, I think, is very much a fiery type of music. So the first little excerpt I'm going to play is from a sonatina by Kabalevsky. So this is just a little bit of it. So tell me if you think this sounds fiery. For the earth element, one of the things I find with earth is that the particular key something in can be important. I find especially E flat major to be a very grounded, earthy kind of key. Now, this little sample that I'm going to play is not in E flat, but B flat, which is really quite close, from Pictures at an Exhibition by Mussorgsky. Now, what I think seems earthy about this is certainly the heaviness in the approach of how to play it. It seems to be quite anchored. There's quite a lot of strong bass stuff in it too. So I think to me, this feels a little bit earthy. So this is just a little bit of that. And a term that is used for a bass line that can be repetitive is actually a ground bass. And this very popular piece, I'm sure people will recognize this, Pachelbel's Canon in D. Because of the repetition of things, there is this sense of familiarity. Maybe even if instead of just earth, this might be considered like fixed, like this sense of being stable. So this is from the Canon in D, where the bass pattern repeats the same throughout the whole piece. For the air element, I find one style of music that's really is suitable is anything contrapuntal or polyphonic. So in the time, for example, of Bach, this was a very common approach to writing, and we would call these voices. There would be voices of music. This, what I'm going to play, is just from a simple two-part invention, where the right hand is considered to have one voice and the left hand is another voice. And the voices often imitate each other as if they were in a conversation. So I think that's why I think of air for this. I have another sample for air, and this is because the composer actually wrote this representing or trying to depict birds, and like birds in flight. So the idea of that, I think, captures this feeling. This is from the Arabesque No. 1 by Claude Debussy. For the water element, I find this is, we can probably find all kinds of music that would be suitable for water, primarily because of the fact that water we associate with emotions. So anything that really rouses the emotions, I think, would be suitable for water. I'm particularly drawn to Chopin for the water element, and I think it's because of how he uses the pedal in playing, which really connects a lot of the sounds together. So things aren't really as dry as they would be in something we would associate with air, for example, but more the sounds blend into each other more. So that was a little clip from a prelude in B minor by Chopin. Just to contrast that was really quite a somber mood. Here's something very joyful by Handel, this Allegro maestoso.
So, Toby, those have been some magnificent pieces that you've brought forward for us, representing the elements that then relate back to the astrology chart and then relate back to healing and back to music. And to be honest, I've been blown away here with your music, and I know I've heard you play previously on a massive organ at one stage, and I know you're an absolutely highly talented musician. I wonder, as we're sitting here in your beautiful music room, if you could share with our listeners a little bit about this piano that you're playing on today.
For sure. This is actually a piano I've had since I was 13 years old. So my parents bought it for me when they realized that I was, doing something in music that, I was quite serious with it. And it was a huge, so it's a Steinway. It's 5'9", so it's a little bigger than a baby grand.
So what is that then? A MIDI grand or
I heard it at one point. It was called a parlor grand.
a parlor grand
yes.
in your music parlor?
Yes, and it's a Model M.
It's
for those
beautiful.
people who know.
In like dark wood here, or
Mahogany.
I beg your pardon, mahogany.
Yeah, and it's almost 100 years old. It was made in 1926.
Good grief!
It's coming up, and it's still all the original parts in it.
And you get it tuned up every year or whatever?
And where I live now, it's difficult to find a tuner on the Sunshine Coast here. But we do have one. Tom, thank you for...
Shout out to Tom, the piano tuner. Yeah. And really, it looks magnificent. I mean, the keys are pristine and gorgeous. They're all super white and beautiful.
Yeah, thank you.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's been a wonderful instrument, and it's moved around with me a lot over the years. Yeah.
And then did you say earlier that you felt that your instrument was piano or...
Oh, yeah, this thing about, try to guess somebody's instrument as well as, we try to guess somebody's sign. Whenever that happened to me, people trying to guess my instrument, they often peg me as voice, like a singer.
Right.
And I find that interesting because actually I do work with a lot of vocalists in choirs. So if you like, I play the choir. Like I conduct choirs, and I've accompanied for choirs all my life, really. So I am around singers a lot.
This is amazing. What type of choirs would that be in general?
Well, here on the Sunshine Coast, I'm playing for a wonderful women's ensemble, Inspirito vocal ensemble. And they do all different types of music, different styles, some traditional classical things, some folk arrangements, some jazz things, different types of world music. It's really quite an assortment.
So you're really quite flexible with your music then as well.
Yeah.
That's great. So to get back to combining the abilities of music to clearly move people that relate to a chart, are you looking further into that?
Yes, but first of all, this idea of making some clear links between the music part and the astrology part, and then using that to target into the healing part.
It's a very interesting concept to bring these three factors together, that clearly you've lived with music for many, many years, and astrology for several years, and healing for perhaps not as many years.
Yeah.
Now, normally in astrology, we associate music, I believe, with Venus and Neptune. Do you still go along with those associations for those planets?
Yes, as for Venus, certainly as an art form, and for the imagination of Neptune and the creativity, absolutely. But I think music can rouse energy from any of the planets.
All of the planets.
All of the planets.
Yes, that's an interesting concept that perhaps if you have a prominent, Jupiter, it's going to invoke you could tap into music in some way. But as we say, traditionally, we're taught Venus, Neptune, there's music, that's it.
Yes.
But it makes interesting something to think about, that you could express music or your musical abilities or singing or what have you through other planets within a chart and not have to be pigeonholed necessarily to these older traditions.
Absolutely.
Great. Okay, Toby. So if we have some musicians out there who are obviously astrologers as well, because that's why they're listening to the podcast, would you be interested in connecting with them, or how could they contact you?
That would be wonderful. I'm very eager to compile a database of musicians. So
musicians' charts?
Yes, people who especially identify with, one instrument. If they've, played it for much of their life, they really feel like they are connected to that instrument. I would love to hear from them. And if they would share then their birth data.
Yeah.
So date of birth, place of birth, time of
birth, the usual birth data. And how could somebody contact you?
Please email me through toby@vancouverastrology.com. That would be the most direct. I'd be happy to hear from people.
Okay, that would be great. And if anybody wants to leave a message for us in general about this particular episode, they can go to Starzology.com, and when the red button pops up in the bottom left, leave a voice message for us, and we can address that later on. I'll pass any messages on to Toby or comments. And this is such an interesting topic. somehow I feel we may have you back in a couple of years, and certainly perhaps at the centenary of your fabulous piano. That would be an ideal time to get you on.
That's great. Thank you, Alison. It's been really fun being with you.
Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you.
Thanks, and goodbye, everybody.
Thanks so much for getting this far through the episode. I just want to take a moment to tell you about the two main options of my astrology services. So the first one is coaching. If you are an aspiring astrologer, and by that I mean someone who's perhaps a hobbyist astrologer or someone who's learning astrology or a student, or you've got a few books and you've been doing it for a while, but perhaps you need a little bit of help to bring it all together, then maybe getting some astrological coaching from me would be the answer for you. The astrology coaching I offer is a 1-hour session on Zoom, and it's tailored to answer your particular questions. For example, if you have issues with natal chart readings, we can go there. Or if you're having problems working with your forecasting, we can go there. Or even basic astrology stuff, or even getting yourself organized for your astrology business. The idea is that astrological coaching will answer your particular questions. It's tailored specifically to you and where you are in your astrological journey. And I'm happy to help you out with some guidance about how you can get going, what to focus on, and what to dismiss. So that would be the astrological coaching for people trying to learn astrology. The second astrological service I offer is consultations. So this is for someone who perhaps doesn't know anything about astrology, but they just want to have their chart read or get their chart done. Call it what you will. So once more, this is a 1-hour consultation over Zoom. I will interpret your chart, tell you about the main features, tell you about where the energy is flowing, and all the rest of what is entailed in a thorough natal chart interpretation. I can also add in some forecasting in there too, bearing in mind we only have 1 hour. So just in summary, I've got coaching for people who want to learn astrology, and I've got consultations for those who want to get an astrology reading done. I'm Alison Price from Starzology.com. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.